able to attend, please switch off your microphones so that we can enjoy everything.
Oh, it's down there at the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
Now I stopped sharing. Светлана? Светлана, микрофон включи, пожалуйста.
My name is Svetlana. I am President Rotary Club Russia. И дальше передаю слово Наташе.
Yeah. Svetlana is our current club president. I will quickly introduce people whom I see now on the screen in the order how I see them. We have Jens Strohschneider from Rotary Club of Moscow Metropole. It's the biggest club in Russian district, and they are German-speaking club. Then I see Svetlana Davidova, who is our new member, and she lives in Vladikavkaz. Светлана, ты можешь помахать вот так рукой.
А я вас не... у меня как его? Вы меня видите?
Мы тебя видим, да, все. Мы видим, что ты помахала. Хорошо.
Да.
Then I see honorary member of our club, Sergei Kirillov, our past president, who lives in city of Novorossiysk, at Black Sea. And then I see Fedor Gladky, our charter president, who lives in city of Krasnodar. And here we have my younger daughter, Tatiana, who lives in Moscow, who is a friend of our club. And then we have a black screen where it states connecting to camera. It's my husband, Ivo, who doesn't have camera on his computer, but he would like to listen to the presentation. So probably some people will will be adding themselves in the process. And it's for me a pleasure and an honor to introduce our today's speaker, John Shively. I hope John will tell a couple of words about himself, why he's interested in history. John.
Спасибо. Добрый день. Меня зовут Иван Иванович. That's about the extent of my Russian.
Да, это все, что он может сказать по-русски.
My wife and I were on a cruise a few months ago in which we met Natalia and her husband Ivo, became good friends with them. While aboard ship, I gave some lectures on World War II in the Pacific against the Japanese, and Ivo and Natalia attended, and Natalia asked me if I'd be interested in doing one of these presentations for her Rotary Club members. And I said, I'd love to. And she eventually said I could talk about anything I wanted to. So I asked her about a battle that was fought in Eastern Mongolia on the Manchurian border in 1939, in which was a very important battle fought between the Imperial Japanese Army and the Soviet Red Army. It was a very consequential battle that affected both the war in Europe and the looming war in the Pacific. And so we set this up, and we've had a couple of trial runs. All the technology seems to work, and I'm going to get started whenever Natalia wants me to on this presentation, as soon as she brings up the first slide.
Thank you, John. I just translate in 2 words what you have said. Как знают члены моего клуба, мой муж Ива и я, мы путешествовали в южной части Тихого океана, и на этом круизе мы познакомились с Джоном, который читал лекции о всяких интересных исторических событиях в регионе Тихого океана. И я попросила Джона, не захочет ли он рассказать что-нибудь интересное для членов нашего клуба. И он предложил тему вот о малоизвестной битве, которую в России знают как битва при Халхин-Голе, а в англоязычной среде ее называют битвой при Намангане. И после определенной подготовки, потому что у Джона это первый опыт делания презентаций онлайн, в результате у нас получилось, что он не может сам показывать слайды. Поэтому слайды буду показывать я, нажимать там на кнопочки. Но из-за того, что мы с вами все находимся в разных частях света, может быть, что это будет переключение с запаздыванием. Прошу вас, так сказать, с пониманием к этому отнести. I have thought that as we are in all the parts of the world, it could be that the change of slides will be delayed so that everybody has understanding for this. And now I'm sharing the screen and go to the first slide.
You want me to get started, Natalia?
Yes, John, do you see the first slide?
I do. Mm-hmm.
As usually, I make a short test and go to second and back to the first so that we see that changing is working. I go to the second slide. Do you see the second slide?
Yes, that works.
And come back to the first one. Now, please feel free. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much. This lecture is about a battle fought along an ill-defined border in Northeast Asia in the summer of 1939 between the Soviet Red Army and their client state, the Mongolian People's Republic, and the Imperial Japanese Army. The results of this battle contributed to a strategic reassessment by Imperial Japanese High Command about where to gain the economic and territorial expansion they sought at the beginning of World War II. In preparing this lecture, I borrowed heavily and primarily from this book, Nomonhan, 1939, The Red Army's Victory That Shaped World War II by Dr. Stuart Goldman. The events described in this book provided me with my first glimpse into understanding of the significance of this obscure and little-known battle on the Mongolian steppe in the summer of 1939 that was consequential for World War II in both the European and Pacific theaters. I have had the pleasure of meeting and getting to know Dr. Goldman, who helped me arrange a tour in 2019 of the Nomonhan battlefield in Mongolia. No cogent study of the antecedents of World War II would be complete without an understanding of this battle. Leading up to the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, Japan sought to negotiate with the Russians of Manchuria and Korea. The Russians demanded all of Manchuria as a Russian sphere of influence and Northern Korea as a buffer zone. Russia threw Japan a bone by offering Southern Korea as a Japanese sphere of influence. This was wholly unacceptable to Tokyo, and it was clear that the Russians were using negotiations only to buy time to build up its military in the region via the Trans-Siberian Railway. Tokyo saw through Russia's duplicity and decided in 1904 that the only way to resolve the difference was to go to war with Russia, and the sooner the better. And so in 1904, the war came without warning and without a declaration of war.
John, excuse me, please. Ivo just told me that he sees slide only small one. Therefore, I'm going to ask the audience whether they see. Скажите, пожалуйста, мне кто-нибудь, вы нормально видите слайды?
Да, большой во весь экран.
Да.
Отлично видно слайды.
Thank
Да,
you.
нормально видно, все хорошо.
Everybody is seeing very good. Thank you, John.
Okay.
Slide 4.
To everyone's surprise, especially Europeans, Japan soundly defeated the Russians on both land and at sea. Japan sought an end to the war and negotiated peace. She invoked the aid of President Theodore Roosevelt in getting the belligerents to the negotiating table. Out of these negotiations, the war was ended with Japan in substantial control of what she set out to get. According to the articles of the treaty, Russia acknowledged Japan's unlimited freedom of action in Korea and agreed to withdraw her troops from Manchuria and setting the new frontier at the Amur and Ussuri rivers. Russia's biggest loss was the Liaotung Peninsula and the warm water port at Port Arthur she so desperately wanted. Russia also relinquished position and control of the South Manchurian Railway and its spur down the length of Korea. According to the articles of the treaty, both Russia and Japan had to pull out of Manchuria proper. Japan withdrew to the Liaotung Peninsula, now known as the Kwantung Lease Territory, and in 1905 set up the Kwantung Army government administration. In 1906, the Kwantung Army was created from the troops who had previously occupied South Manchuria. Its main objective was to control and protect the South Manchurian Railway, a future route into Manchuria, and it was hoped into eastern Siberia all the way to Lake Baikal. 2 years after the war, Japan and Russia concluded a secret treaty. In this treaty, Russia recognized Korea as a sphere of influence of Japanese influence, and Japan recognized Outer Mongolia as a Russian sphere of influence. Manchuria was equally divided between Japan and Russia, with the Imperial Japanese Army firmly entrenched in the Kwantung Lease territory of the Liaotung Peninsula. After the Russian Revolution and the Civil War that followed, the Russian army was less of a threat to Japan. At the time, China seemed to disintegrate into civil war. Following the bloodletting of the First World War, nearly all of Japan's traditional rivalries, with the notable exception of the United States, had been seriously weakened, paralyzed, or liquidated. As a way to fight the perceived threat of communism that had taken hold in Russia a few years earlier, the Allies sought to intervene on the side of the White Russians. The Siberian intervention was a multinational military expedition launched during the Russian Civil War in 1918. The initial goals were to help the Czechoslovak Legion secure supplies of munition and armaments in Russian ports and to reestablish the Eastern Front against the Germans. The Czechoslovak Legion was trapped along the Trans-Siberian Railway and at Vladivostok. To effect this rescue, several Allied forces were sent to Vladivostok, including 13,000 Americans on the orders of President Wilson. Japan initially asked to contribute 7,000 troops, eventually sent 70,000. This large Japanese force made the Allies, especially the Americans, wary of the real Japanese motivations. Even though one goal of the intervention was to reestablish the Eastern Front, the Japanese never intended to proceed any further west than Lake Baikal. Their real motive was to set up a buffer state in eastern Siberia to put as much territory between them and communist Russia. The Americans, suspicious of Japanese intentions, stayed behind to keep an eye on the Japanese. In the end, the Japanese were unsuccessful in creating a separate state in eastern Siberia, and the Red Army won the Civil War, and the Soviet Union was born. The Americans were evacuated in 1920, but the Japanese remained behind until 1922, before they too were evacuated. By the 1920s, the Imperial Japanese Army had undergone a dramatic change. Junior officers began to usurp increasing control over Army policy, especially within the Kwantung Army on the Liaotung Peninsula in the Kwantung Lease territory. A peculiar Japanese aberration began to assert itself within the Kwantung Army called Gekko Kujo, which literally means rule from below. In practice, it meant insubordination to higher authority and command. Many of the Kwantung Army senior leaders overtly advocated political change in Japan through the violent overthrow of the civilian government and reorganization along totalitarian state lines. It advocated a more aggressive, expansionist foreign policy regarding the Asian mainland, especially in China and Manchuria. After defeating the Russians in 1905, the Kwantung Army was established to defend the Kwantung Lease territory, especially the South Manchurian Railway Zone. Its headquarters were located at Port Arthur. Although the Kwantung Army was nominally subordinate to the Imperial Japanese headquarters and the senior office at the Army General Staff, its leadership often acted in direct violation of the orders from Tokyo without suffering any consequences. Without consulting Tokyo, it carried out the assassination of the Manchurian warlord in 1928. Japan lacked many of the natural resources needed to fight a continental army. These, among others, included iron ore, coal, food staples, and timber. Japan had to import many of these natural resources. In any future war, these resources might be cut off. These resources were in abundance in Manchuria. As far as the Kwantung Army was concerned, Manchuria would serve not only as a buffer state against the Soviet Union, but also a source of natural resources to wage war. Manchuria was ripe for the picking. From its toehold on the continent in the Kwantung Lease territory and port facilities of Port Arthur and the South Manchurian Railway, which was the Japanese Army controlled, the way was open to Manchuria for economic and agrarian exploitation. After Manchuria After Manchuria, who knew how far they could go? They had always had designs on the Trans-Baikal area of Siberian Russia. The question remained, what pretext could they use to make the move into Manchuria? On September 18, 1931, Shisoshiro Ikekagi, the Kwantung Army's chief of intelligence, and Colonel Kanji Ishiwara carried out a carefully plotted fake attack at Mukden. They tried to blow up a railway line, then blame it on Chinese bandits. Despite careful planning, they bungled the operation. The tracks were only slightly damaged, and trains passed harmlessly over them soon after the explosion. Even the Japanese engineering experts were baffled. Here they are inspecting the damage. Even though the sabotage attempt was a failure, it accomplished its intended aim. Known to the world as the Manchurian Incident, it gave Japan the necessary pretext for the well-prepared Kwantung Army to move in and occupy, within a matter of hours, all the key points across the large territory of Manchuria. Within a matter of months, Japanese troops occupied all of Manchuria and set up a puppet government called Manchukuo, nominally ruled by the deposed Manchu Emperor Henry Puyi, all under the control of the Kwantung Army. Japan's occupation of Manchuria profoundly altered its relations with the Soviet Union. To the north and east, Manchuria shared a long border with the Soviet Union. To the west lay the Mongolian People's Republic. The Japanese Empire had suddenly and violently acquired a 3,000-mile border with the Soviet Union, a border with their arch-enemy and one that had to be defended. The border was mostly riverine, following the Amur eastward to its confluence with the Ussuri River, then south to a point where the boundaries of Korea, Manchuria, and the Russian maritime provinces meet. Between 1939 and 1945, there were over 1,000 border violations and armed clashes between the Soviet Red Army and the Imperial Japanese Army. The most notable of these border incidents took place during the summer of 1939 near the little Manchurian village of Nomonhan. It was a virtual undeclared war between the Soviet Union and Japan that had implications for the war in Europe and the looming war in the Pacific. The Battle of Nomonhan, as the Japanese referred to it, involved over 100,000 men, 1,000 tanks, and 1,000 planes, and accounted for 30 to 50,000 casualties on both sides. Nomonhan is a little village located in northwestern Manchuria near the border with Mongolia, now the Mongolian People's Republic, the second communist country after the Soviet Union. Nomonhan was located on the east side of the Halhal River, which the Japanese claimed was the border between Manchuria and Mongolia. The Soviets and the Mongolians claimed that their border was about 10 miles east of the river. The area between these two disputed borders was the site of the most consequential border clash, the one that took place in the summer of 1939. According to Imperial Japanese Army sources, while the Kwantung Army was mopping up the last armed resistance in Manchuria, the Soviet Union began bolstering its defenses in the Far East. By the time the Japanese forces turned their attention to the international boundary, the Soviets had made substantial progress in strengthening their defenses. These measures included double tracking the Trans-Siberian Railway, constructing large-scale border fortifications, and increasing garrison units from 2 to 3 in 1932 to 20 in 1934. In response, the Japanese began a major program of border fortifications. Additionally, new railroad lines were constructed in Manchuria along military lines. Japan then planned to relocate 1,000 people from Japan to Nipponize Manchuria. The battle at Nomonhan took place on the eastern Mongolian steppe along the Halhal River. I took this photo from the hills over which the Soviet tanks and infantry attacked across the Halhal River. This Japanese officer, Major Tsuji, was a middle-level, brash, impudent Japanese officer who played an outsized role in the battle and wrote the orders that encouraged the Japanese to move across the border and attack the Soviets and Mongolians who frequently moved east of the river to what they claimed was sovereign Mongolian territory. During the night of May 10th and 11th, 1939, a 20-man Mongolian People's Republic border patrol crossed the Halhal River and moved east toward the village of Nomonhan. The next morning, they were discovered by Manchukuan forces of the north of the Halston River. A Manchukuan cavalry force of about 40 men drove them back over the Halhal River. Over the course of the next several days, the two sides clashed, escalating the fighting each time to what started out as a mere border skirmish to become a Soviet-Japanese confrontation. Each side blamed the other for instigating the fighting, but nearly all accounts agree that the actual fighting was initiated by the Manchukuan forces. Much of the fighting took place near this stream, the Holston River. Soviet armor included the BA-10 armored car and the BT-5 tank, each equipped with a high-velocity 45mm gun. The Japanese had no anti-tank weapon to counter Soviet armor. The escalating conflict with Japan was cause for great concern in Moscow, especially as war in Europe loomed on the horizon. To bolster their position on the Manchurian-Mongolian border, the Kremlin ordered Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, an early proponent of tank warfare, to take command in the east. On arrival at the front in Mongolia, Zhukov inspected the combat zone near the Halhal River. His report to Moscow indicated that the fighting near the Halhal River, also known as Hakingal, did not appear to be a mere border clash. In his estimation, the Japanese were likely to escalate their aggression, and his current troop disposition did not seem adequate to stop them. Based on Zhukov's battlefield assessment, Moscow rushed infantry and armor reinforcements to the Mongolian front along the Trans-Siberian Railway. Throughout the summer of 1939, the fighting continued as each side crossed into what the other side claimed was their side of the border. Each side continued to reinforce its position, raising the ante for ever greater battles with mounting casualties. The Japanese did not believe that the Soviets could counterattack because they thought it was logistically impossible to move enough supplies from Moscow along the continent-long Trans-Siberian Railway and then to truck it to the battlefield at the Mongolian-Manchurian border. The nearest Japanese supply depot was only 50 miles away. The nearest Soviet line to the front from the railhead at Borgia was over 400 miles away. Stalin had an ace up his sleeve that proved invaluable in the summer of 1939. He had a spy in Tokyo. Richard Sorga was a German Azerbaijani journalist and Soviet military intelligence officer who was active before and during World War II and worked undercover as a German journalist in both Nazi Germany and in Japan. Throughout the pre-war period, he provided valuable intelligence to Stalin about Japanese diplomatic and military intentions. Some have made the claim that he was the best spy of all time. Sorga reported to Stalin that Japan's top political and military leaders sought to prevent the escalation of the conflict at Nomonhan into an all-out war. These developments gave the cautious Stalin confidence to commit the Red Army to large-scale combat operations in eastern Mongolia. In early August, Stalin gave Zhukov the order to prepare a major offensive to clear the Nomonhan area of the Japanese who had violated Mongolian territory once and for all. The battle between the Soviet Red Army and the Japanese Imperial Army reached its climax in August 1939. Following the massive movement of Soviet supplies east along the Trans-Siberian Railway, Zhukov was ready to launch his counteroffensive. The Kwantung Army was dug in static defensive positions north and south of the Holston River, east of the Halha River. Zhukov's operational plan was simple. He would divide the First Army Group into 3 strike forces. The central force was to launch a frontal assault and tie down the main Japanese strength. At the same time, the northern and southern strike forces with the bulk of the armor were to turn in the Japanese flanks and force them into a pocket that would then be reduced and destroyed by the combined efforts of all 3 forces. On August 31st, Zhukov declared the disputed territory between the Halha River and the boundary line that ran through Nomonhan to be clear of Japanese troops. The Japanese army had been annihilated with between 18,000 and 23,000 casualties along the border between May and September. The casualty rate for the 23rd Division was 76%. It was the worst military defeat in modern Japanese history up to that point. Zhukov was capable of pushing on well beyond Nomonhan, but was ordered by Moscow to stop at the Soviet-claimed border. The Japanese foreign minister instructed their ambassador in Moscow to open negotiations with the Soviet government for a speedy settlement of the incident. He was authorized to accept the boundary claimed by the Mongolians as the basis for a temporary ceasefire agreement. Following the battle, Marshal Zhukov was ordered back to Moscow, where he was awarded the Order of Lenin and the Hero of Soviet Union medals. Here is Marshal Zhukov probably standing at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin after the war with 3 Hero of the Soviet Union medals. On June 22, 1941, Hitler scrapped the German-Soviet non-aggression pact and invaded Russia. The German Wehrmacht initially enjoyed huge success as they moved east along a 2,900-kilometer front. It was the largest invasion force in history and resulted in enormous casualties on both sides. The early success of the German army against the Russians in the summer of 1941 was astonishing. In just 4 months, they were poised at the gates of Moscow. Military experts predicted that the Red Army was on the verge of collapse and that the Soviet Union would be defeated in a matter of months or sooner. The Germans could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. Stalin's spy in Tokyo, Richard Sorga, informed Stalin that the Japanese were withdrawing some of their forces from the Mongolian-Manchurian front and that they had made a strategic decision to not pursue any further offensive moves against the Red Army in the north, and that they had made an irrevocable decision to move south against Southeast Asia instead. With this information from the spy that Stalin trusted, Moscow began a massive redeployment of its forces from the Mongolian border to the Moscow front. More than half of the strength of the Soviet Far Eastern Army was transferred from the east to Europe in the fall of 1941. The majority went to the Moscow front. Under the command of Marshal Zhukov and with some of the forces brought to Moscow from Siberia on December 5, 1941, the Soviet army launched a huge counteroffensive that initially relieved the Moscow siege and eventually forced the German army to retreat. Spearheaded by Zhukov's tanks, the Red Army surrounded Berlin in April 1945. Hitler committed suicide and the war was over. American and Soviet forces met at the Elbe River on April 25, 1945. In summary, the Battle of Nomonhan is a mostly unknown but important battle fought on the Eastern Mongolian steppe prior to the start of World War II that was consequential for both the European and Pacific theaters. In part, it played a part in the Japanese decision to go south after the mineral-rich resource areas in Southeast Asia and the oil in the Dutch East Indies rather than north against their historic enemy, Russia. Using the same tactics that he used against the Japanese at Nomonhan, Marshal Zhukov defeated the German Wehrmacht at the very gates of Moscow, thereby saving Russia from almost certain defeat in 1941. Spasiba.
Now I have stopped sharing the screen, and we have time for possible questions. But I would like to thank John for this very interesting presentation. I hope all from you have learned something new or unknown facts. Who would like to ask questions either in English or in Russian, please raise your hand so that I see you.
Я просто хотела сказать, что прекрасная презентация, смотрела прямо не отрываясь. Ну и надеюсь, что у кого-нибудь из людей наших найдутся какие-то вопросы.
Yeah. Our club president Svetlana would like to thank you very much. It was very interesting for her. She was enjoying following your presentation, and she hopes that some from the audience will have further questions. I see that Jens has raised his hand. Jens, you may probably ask in English and then I translate you in Russian, or how you prefer.
Whatever you like, Natalia. John, yes, indeed, a very good presentation. Thank you very much. I have two questions, actually. One question is about facts. Yeah, how many troops have been transferred from Siberia or the Far East to Moscow in December 41? Yeah, this is my first question. And
just
my
a moment, Jens, may I translate your question?
Yes, please.
And then John will answer, and well, we go to the second
Just a
question.
second, Natalia. Так, первый вопрос мой, это, собственно, сколько людей были транспортированы из Дальнего Востока Советского Союза в Москву зимой 41 года. Это просто факты, хотел бы понимать масштабы. John, please.
I can't give you a good number. I just know that it was substantial. Reinforcements went from Moscow or from Siberia to the Moscow front. I would guess it was tens of thousands of infantry and maybe 1,000 tanks. From what I've read of the Battle of Moscow, Germany was very close to defeating the Russians at the gates of Moscow, and probably would have lost the Battle of Moscow had these reinforcements not been moved from Siberia. And to add a little more detail, at the time, Japan and Germany were nominal allies. And after the Germans invaded Russia in 1941, the Germans, von Ribbentrop, asked the Japanese to invade Russia from the east. Here was their best chance to get even for the humiliating defeat at Nomonhan. And had they done that, it would have forced Stalin to fight a two-front war. In World War II, the only belligerents that were able to fight a two-front war and win was the United States. All the other belligerents had to fight a two-front war. Germany, Britain, Russia, the Japanese all fought two-front wars and lost. The only country that avoided a two-front war was Russia, because they were able to, using their spy in Russia, in Tokyo, to learn that the Japanese were not interested in fighting the Russians, and that allowed Stalin to move thousands and thousands of troops and tanks from the eastern part of Siberia to Moscow, and therefore avoid a two-front war. Stalin was a very shrewd politician. I'll have to give him credit for that.
Let me translate quickly the answer. Джон сказал, что он не может назвать точную цифру фактов в ответ на вопрос Йенса, сколько именно, какое количество солдат и оборудования было передвинуто с Дальнего Востока на Московский фронт, но если бы он мог угадывать, он бы сказал, что речь шла о десятках тысяч пехотинцев и как минимум о 1000 танков, которые были перемещены с Дальнего Востока на Московский фронт. При этом он напоминает о том, что в тот момент Германия и Япония являлись номинальными союзниками. И, конечно, в Германии ожидали, что Япония нападет в этот момент на ослабленный Советский Союз. Но этого не произошло именно потому, что незадолго до этого японцы потерпели сокрушительное поражение в битве при Намангане. И если бы все-таки это произошло, Япония напала бы на Советский Союз, то пришлось бы Советскому Союзу бороться на два фронта, что, в общем-то, существенно усложнило бы ситуацию. С точки зрения Джона, в тот момент единственной страной, которая могла и в какой-то момент боролась на два фронта, это было США. Так, Jens, second question.
Maybe I pass over to Sergei so that everyone can post a question, and then once we are through, you can come back to me. Sergei, please.
Сережа, пожалуйста.
Во-первых, хочу поблагодарить Джона за интересную презентацию, помочь ему с ответом. Сейчас прежде чем задам свой вопрос, скажу предложение. Вот я быстро загуглил, в период с июня по декабрь 1941 года с Дальневосточного и Сибирского фронта было переброшено 12 стрелковых, 5 танковых и 1 моторизованная дивизия. Это почти 123 тысячи солдат и офицеров, более 2000 орудий и минометов, более 2000 легких танков, 12 тысяч автомобилей и 1500 тягачей и тракторов. Ну, это так.
Ты подожди, дай мне перевести, я записываю, конечно. So, before Sergei, before he asks the question, he can help you with the numbers, because when he was listening to the question from Jens and to your answer, he Googled quickly, and according to Google, between June and December 1941, from far east to Moscow front, it was transformed about 123,000 soldiers and officers, more than 2,000 tanks, and about 12,000 automobiles, so the special cars. But now Sergei will ask his question. Сереж, пожалуйста.
Теперь вопрос. У Джона это хобби, изучение военной истории, или это профессиональная деятельность? И если, как бы Джону интересно, у меня есть издание 1913 года, 4 тома «Русско-японская война». То есть это не советское издание. Российской империи, документальная, так сказать, военные мемуары. Если Джону интересно, ну, это на русском языке. Да. Ну, еще со старыми вот этими буквами, так скажем. Ну, в общем-то...
Хорошо, да.
Да,
Так
вот
ты
такое.
что, предлагаешь их
Ну,
поделиться?
мне не сложно, если есть большой интерес,
но на русском языке, да.
захочет ли он это изучить, можно это там сосканировать в PDF. Я просто являюсь еще там, ну, подписанным на библиотеку историческую. То есть, ну, у меня есть возможность, там, я получаю от ребят книги, изданные до 1900, до начала века, ну, в общем, 20-го.
Так, давай сначала начнем с вопроса. The question is, John, it was an excellent presentation. The question from Sergey is military history your hobby, or are you interested professionally for the military history? And second part, probably it is interesting for you. Sergey has 4 books printed in 1913, 4 books about Russian-Japanese war, but they are in Russian. So, firstly, please answer how is it about military history?
I am trained as a physician. I'm a retired doctor, physician. The study of the Second World War in the Pacific against the Japanese is merely a hobby. I started studying the war about 24 years ago. I've written 2 books about people from my home state of Indiana who fought in the war against the Japanese. And I have visited most of the island battlefields in the Pacific. And now I'm a tour guide to the island battlefields. And in fact, in 2 weeks, I'm taking a group of 33 people to the island battlefield of Iwo Jima in the middle of the Pacific, just south of Japan. So to answer your question, Sergey, I'm not trained as a historian. It is a hobby, and I study the war all the time. And I have YouTube. I have a YouTube channel page with lots of lectures on the war, and then I'm a tour guide. But I'm not a professional historian by any stretch of the imagination.
Ну, как вы уже поняли, Джон сказал, что если в 2 словах, то это его хобби. Он по своей профессии, он врач, врач-терапевт, но он на пенсии, и в течение уже 24 лет он изучает историю, военную историю, написал 2 книги, у него есть канал на YouTube, где можно посмотреть его лекции. Началось это все с того, что он изучал вопрос участия американских военных из его родного штата Индианы в театре военных действий в Тихоокеанском регионе. И сейчас, помимо того, что он пишет книги и вот лекции рассказывает, он также является гидом, туристическим гидом. Он возит группы на этот театр военных действий. И, в частности, через 2 недели у него намечена поездка с группой из 23 человек на японский остров Ива-Джима, где они будут, так сказать, рассказывать и смотреть на месте.
Уместно или нет, мой прапрадед Христофор Ушаков был камчатским казаком, воевал с японцами на Дальнем Востоке, а бабушка и дедушка родом с Дальнего Востока награждены медалями за победу над Японией.
Да. Just as a side note, the grandfather of Sergei was Cossack in Far East region. He participated in the first Russian-Japanese war, and his grandmother and grandfather got medals for the victory over Japan in the Second World War. So, я думаю, что мы передаем еще слово Йенсу, у него был второй вопрос, да? Йенс, ты его еще не забыл, второй вопрос?
Михаила Жигарева, мама, ты пропускаешь.
еще
У него
другие
тоже
вопросы, давайте, да.
вопрос.
Мгм.
Хорошо, я просто не всех вижу, у меня на экране не все помещаются, извините, если я кого-то обидела. Кто тут еще хотел? Кто хотел? Миша, ты хотел? Задавай вопрос. Вот сейчас я включила и увидела.
Добрый вечер, друзья. В качестве ремарки хочу сказать, что дед моей супруги Малинов Василий Васильевич профессиональный военный. Он закончил службу в звании полковника железнодорожных войск. И он как раз принимал участие в битве на Халкинголе. В частности, по его словам, по его утверждению, войну выиграл Жуков. Ну, это так, да? А мой вопрос задал Сергей, поэтому мне остается только сказать спасибо большое.
Миш, ты включи на секундочку камеру, может быть. Вот, все, я вас вижу. Все вижу. A question from another member of our club, Mikhail Zhigarev and his spouse Yelena. You see this couple probably just for the grandfather of Yelena, Vasily Vasilyevich Malina. He participated in this battle of Nomongan, and he always told that the Second World War was won by Marshal Zhukov.
Marshal Zhukov played a very prominent role in the war against the Germans. He was rightly decorated with the three heroes of the Soviet Union. Yes, he was a very good general. He knew tank warfare as well as anybody, as well as Field Marshal Montgomery of the British, and as well as Patton of the U.S. Army.
Да, Джон говорит, что маршал Жуков был выдающимся военачальником. Он, как никто другой, умел пользоваться преимуществами, так сказать, танковой войны. Его можно сравнить с британским военачальником Монтгомери, и вот американского я просто не расслышала имя. И я вижу, что у Светланы Сидоровой есть еще вопрос. Светлана, задавай свой вопрос.
У меня скорее не вопрос, а тоже такое дополнение. Мой папа, профессор Сидоров Владимир Васильевич, который был по образованию и по науке физиком, он очень интересовался, он был очень разносторонний, стихи писал и очень интересовался историей. И в том числе и тем периодом тоже интересовался. И поэтому я с очень интересом, с большим интересом слушала, мне очень понравилось выступление, и большая благодарность.
Да. Svetlana would like just not to ask a question, just to add an additional notice. Her father, her late father, Professor Sidorov, who was a charter president of Rotary Club of Kazan, he was a scientist, a professor for physics, but he had many sides of his talent. He wrote poetry and also was deeply interested in the history. And therefore, she appreciates so much that your presentation. She really enjoyed it. Now, I don't see any other hands, and Jens, if you still have your second question, I think.
Yes, actually, I would like to better understand the political background. So we all know that the Second World War II finished in Asia, and there are a lot of historians who say the war actually started in Asia too. Yeah, especially because of the USSR. Deployed a very aggressive foreign policy towards its neighbors. So we all remember the Soviet Union occupied northeast China, the Republic of Tuva. There were invasions into Afghanistan and Iran. So in 1939, the Germans and the Japanese invited the Soviet Union to take part in an overall global alliance. Yeah. So we all remember we had the Hitler-Stalin Pact, yeah, in September. And their voices and yeah, people think, okay, the suddenly stop of Marshal Zhukov after this victory, yeah, was because Stalin nevertheless liked to balance his relationships with Germany, Nazi Germany, and Japan, and keep open all doors for a potential pact with these two military states. Yeah. Did you see anything in your studies, yeah, which could be connected to this?
Just a moment, let me translate the
Я могу
question.
перевести, если
Пожалуйста,
нужно.
да.
Да,
Да,
конечно.
пожалуйста, скажи, пожалуйста.
Да, то есть, по моему убеждению, Вторая мировая война начиналась тоже в Азии, когда Советский Союз напал на Китай где-то в 1932-1933 году. Советский Союз занимал северо-восток Китая, Монголию, Республика Тува, да, да. И в 1939 году общался и заключилось там соглашение с Гитлером, да, и было предложение Сталину, собственно, поступить в альянс с Японией и с Германией. Да, это, да. И тут мой вопрос, да, вот этот сюрприз, что Жуков после победы убедительно остановился и дальше не пошел. Связано ли это с этой общей политикой? Там, Сталина найти или быть в любом положении готов там, заключать дополнительный договор с Японией или поступить там, в этот альянс с фашистской Германией и милитаристической Японией? Вот такой вопрос у меня был. John?
Yeah. Yeah, I have studied the diplomatic background to this battle. At the time, as I said earlier, Stalin was very eager to avoid a two-front war. He did not think, and I think he was correct, that he could not fight the Germans in the West and the Japanese in the East and survive. And a lot of historians, both in the United States and in Russia, have concluded that Russia probably would not have survived had the Japanese attacked in the East when the Germans wanted them to. To this end, Stalin was in negotiations with both Japan and Germany and Britain and France to line up alliances to counter the other side. And eventually, he signed the non-aggression pact with Germany that allowed him to move his forces. So he, by this alliance with Germany in the non-aggression pact, he stabilized he stabilized the Russian front, and was therefore able to move his forces, Zhukov and all the tanks and men, to the Mongolian front, defeat the Japanese, and then, of course, Hitler tore up the non-aggression pact and attacked attacked Russia and got all the way to the gates. But he knew from his spy in Tokyo that the Japanese had decided that, not primarily, but certainly a contributing factor in the Japanese decision not to invade Russia in the East was their experience with the Russian army at Nomonhan. The Imperial Japanese Army was all in favor of going after Russia. That was their historic enemy. The Navy, Japanese Navy, actually wanted to go south to Indonesia and get the oil in the Dutch East Indies. But one of the strongest advocates in the Imperial Japanese Army for going south was this guy Tsuji, because he had fought the Russians at Nomonhan and knew what it was like to fight the Russians. He didn't want to have anything to do with the Russians again. He was the army's strongest advocate for going after the oil in the South. So the diplomatic back and forth was very important, and it ultimately led to Japanese decision not to go into the north, into Siberia, to go south. And the other interesting thing, had the Japanese army gone into eastern Siberia, they also could not have attacked Southeast Asia. Had that been the case, Pearl Harbor might not ever have been bombed. In that case, under what conditions would the United States have entered the war? Very interesting question about what would happen.
Да, я попробую перевести в двух словах ответ на вопрос Йенса. Ну, во-первых, Джон сказал, что он специально не изучал, так сказать, дипломатическую подноготную вот этого периода. У него нет просто таких источников. Но вот то, что он думает, что действительно Сталин в любой момент, он искал союзников везде, где только можно. То есть он искал их, и можно ли что-то заключить с Японией, можно ли что-то с Англией, с Францией, с гитлеровской Германией. В конце концов, это вылилось именно в пакт о ненападении, известный нам всем как пакт Молотова-Риббентропа. И это позволило, пока этот пакт действовал, именно это позволило Сталину послать Жукова со своими войсками на Холхин-Гол и добиться там вот поражения императорской Японии. Понятно, что потом Гитлер нарушил этот пакт о ненападении и напал на Советский Союз. Но именно в то время, именно после такого тяжелого поражения императорской Японии при Холхин-Голе, одним из основных действующих лиц японской армии был как раз тот полковник Суджи, которого мы видели на презентации, который настолько был сыт по горло результатами, так сказать, борьбы с советскими войсками на Холхин-Голе, что он ни при каких обстоятельствах не хотел иметь больше с ними ничего общего. И внес свой вклад к тому, чтобы склонить руководство японской армии к тому, чтобы пойти на юго-восток, то есть в регион Тихого океана, а не нападать на Советский Союз. С другой стороны, если бы вот Япония, если мы гипотезу рассмотрим и подумаем, что если бы все-таки Япония напала на Советский Союз одновременно с Германией, то, во-первых, могло случиться, что, так сказать, Советский Союз бы распался, что не вынес бы такого нападения с двух сторон, хотя, в общем, спекулировать на этот счет трудно, но, вероятно, в этом случае японцы бы не напали на Перл-Харбор, и, соответственно, не произошли все те события, которые произошли после этого с сбросом атомных бомб, и мы не знаем, вступила ли бы США в таком случае во Вторую мировую войну. Вот. То есть это вот такой открытый вопрос. Да. We have actually time over. If somebody else have a question or a remark, it's the last chance to do this. Otherwise, I will stop recording. And